The afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of St. Mary's Hospital in Los Angeles, casting long golden stripes across the sterile white floor. In room 307, 38-year-old Michael Reeves adjusted himself against the paper-thin pillows that did little to comfort his increasingly frail frame. The steady beep of the heart monitor provided an unwelcome rhythm to his thoughts as he absent-mindedly ran his fingers over the smooth surface of a weathered DVD case. Unforgiven, his favorite Eastwood film. Outside his door, nurses shuffled between rooms, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum, the sound mingling with distant announcements over the PA system and the occasional ping of elevator doors. Michael had grown accustomed to these sounds over the past 6 months, the soundtrack to his battle with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. "How are you feeling today?" asked Sarah, his nurse for the afternoon shift, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to become hardened by it. "Like I could outrun Usain Bolt," Michael replied with a weak smile, his attempt at humor belied by the hollowness in his once vibrant green eyes. Sarah chuckled as she checked his IV. "Your sister called. She said she's bringing someone special to visit you tomorrow." Michael nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. At 38, he had expected to be in the prime of his life, perhaps married with children by now, certainly not confined to a hospital bed with his life measured in weeks rather than decades. Before the diagnosis, he had been a high school film teacher, inspiring the next generation with his passion for cinema. His students often teased him about his unhealthy obsession with Clint Eastwood films, but they respected his encyclopedic knowledge and genuine enthusiasm. If you're enjoying this story of hope and unexpected connections, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We share stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the unexpected moments that change lives forever. Now back to Michael's journey. As twilight descended over Los Angeles, painting the sky in watercolor hues of purple and orange, Michael drifted between sleep and wakefulness. The medication made it difficult to distinguish between reality and dreams. In his half-conscious state, he found himself on the set of Gran Torino, watching Eastwood direct with precision and purpose, commanding respect without raising his voice. Michael had always admired that quality, the ability to lead through quiet strength rather than bluster. Morning arrived with the clatter of breakfast trays and the shift change of hospital staff. Michael picked at his bland scrambled eggs, moving them around the plate more than eating them. His appetite had abandoned him weeks ago, along with 40 pounds of his former self. "Big day today," chirped an unfamiliar nurse, her cheerfulness slightly grating on Michael's nerves. "I hear you've got a special visitor." Michael offered a polite smile, though he couldn't recall who would be visiting. His sister Lisa visited regularly, sometimes bringing his niece Emma, whose 7-year-old enthusiasm temporarily brightened the sterile hospital room. But a special visitor. His medication-addled mind couldn't place the reference. Around noon, he heard a commotion in the hallway. Hushed but excited voices, the squeaking of shoes moving faster than the usual hospital pace. Lisa appeared in his doorway, her face flushed with an expression he hadn't seen in months. Excitement. "Mikey," she whispered using his childhood nickname, "are you ready for this?" Before he could respond, she turned to someone outside his line of vision and nodded. The first thing Michael noticed were the shoes, expensive Italian leather, perfectly polished. His gaze traveled upward, taking in the tailored pants, the casual but undoubtedly costly jacket, and finally the face that he had watched on screen for thousands of hours throughout his life. Clint Eastwood stood in his hospital room. Michael blinked several times, convinced the medications were causing hallucinations. But the legendary actor remained, his weathered face creased in a tentative smile, those famous narrowed eyes now showing a gentleness rarely captured on camera. "Mr. Reeves," Eastwood said, his voice carrying that familiar rasp that had delivered countless iconic lines, "I heard you're a fan." The understatement hung in the air as Michael struggled to form words, his mouth suddenly dry. The moment felt surreal, the Hollywood legend standing awkwardly by his hospital bed, waiting for a response from a dying man he'd never met. "Mr. Eastwood," Michael finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've spent my entire life studying your work. I teach," he corrected himself. I taught film because of you. Eastwood moved closer to the bed, pulling up the visitor's chair that Lisa had vacated. The famous director sat down with the casual grace that had characterized his movements on screen for decades. Your sister wrote me a letter, Eastwood explained, glancing at Lisa, who stood nervously by the door. She told me about your situation and your work inspiring young filmmakers. I happened to be in town for a few days, so he shrugged as if dropping by a cancer patient's hospital room was a casual detour in his day. Michael's mind raced with questions. How had Lisa managed this? Why would someone of Eastwood's stature take time to visit an anonymous fan? But before he could articulate any of these thoughts, a coughing fit seized him, his body convulsing with the effort. Embarrassment flooded his face as Eastwood patiently waited for the episode to pass. What happened next would later be described by Lisa as the moment everything changed. Instead of showing pity or discomfort, reactions Michael had grown accustomed to, Eastwood leaned forward, his expression unchanged, and asked in that straightforward manner that had defined his career, "Which of my films got it wrong?" The unexpected question hung in the air. Michael, still recovering from his coughing fit, stared at Eastwood in confusion. Everyone thinks they're all masterpieces, Eastwood continued, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But you've studied them. You teach them. So tell me which ones missed the mark. Don't worry about hurting my feelings. At my age, I've heard it all. The tension that had filled the room dissipated as Michael found himself laughing, a genuine laugh that temporarily pushed aside the constant pain. For the first time in months, he wasn't being treated as a dying man, but as a film expert whose opinion mattered. Well, Michael began, his voice stronger now, animated by passion rather than politeness. I always thought The Rookie didn't quite live up to what it could have been. Eastwood nodded thoughtfully. Interesting choice. Why's that? As Michael launched into his analysis, the hospital room transformed. No longer was it a sterile reminder of his mortality, but a place of vibrant discussion about art, intention, and execution. Eastwood listened intently, occasionally nodding or offering brief insights into his directorial decisions. Lisa watched from the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. It had taken dozens of letters, countless phone calls, and shameless begging to make this meeting happen. She had expected a brief courtesy visit, a handshake, a photo, perhaps an autograph. What she witnessed instead was a genuine connection forming between her brother and his lifelong idol. After nearly an hour of animated discussion about Eastwood's filmography, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Your sister mentioned you're working on a screenplay, Eastwood said, his tone casual but his eyes intent on Michael's face. Michael shot a glance at Lisa, surprised she had mentioned his unfinished work. It's nothing, really. Just something to keep my mind occupied during treatment. What's it about? Eastwood pressed, seemingly genuinely interested. Michael hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about sharing his creative work with one of cinema's greatest storytellers. But something in Eastwood's expression, an absence of judgment perhaps, gave him the courage to continue. It's about a high school teacher who discovers he has terminal cancer, Michael began, acutely aware of the parallels to his own situation. But instead of the usual story of coming to terms with death, he becomes obsessed with the legacy of his teaching. He starts tracking down former students to see if he made any difference in their lives. Eastwood's expression remained neutral, but his eyes never left Michael's face. And does he? Make a difference, I mean, Eastwood asked after a moment of silence. That's the thing, Michael replied, his voice growing softer. Some students don't even remember him. Others have painful memories of his class. It's not the affirming experience he hoped for. So what's the resolution? Eastwood pressed. Michael shrugged, wincing slightly at the pain the movement caused. I haven't figured that out yet. That's where I'm stuck. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Eastwood seemed to be considering something, his weathered face unreadable. Then, with a decisiveness that had characterized so many of his on-screen personas, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook and pen. May I? He asked, gesturing to the side of Michael's bed. Confused but intrigued, Michael nodded. Eastwood scribbled something in the notebook, tore out the page and handed it to Michael. My personal email, he explained, noting Michael's surprised expression. When you finish that screenplay, send it to me. I'd like to read it. Michael stared at the paper in his hand. The handwritten email address of Clint Eastwood, seemingly impossible, yet undeniably real. But I don't know if I'll... The unfinished sentence hung in the air, a recognition of Michael's grim prognosis. Then you'd better get writing, Eastwood replied simply, the statement neither callous nor overly sentimental. It was a challenge, an acknowledgement of Michael's situation coupled with a refusal to treat him as already gone. Something shifted in Michael at that moment, a subtle but profound change that was almost palpable in the hospital room. Where before there had been resignation in his eyes, now there was a flicker of determination, faint but unmistakable. As Eastwood prepared to leave, promising to check in when his schedule allowed, Michael found his voice again. "Mr. Eastwood," he called, causing the actor to turn at the doorway. "In Unforgiven, William Money says, 'We all have it coming, kid.' I used to think that line was about justice or karma, but now I think maybe it's just about mortality, how it comes for all of us, deserved or not." Eastwood considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe so, but there's a difference between having it coming and giving up before it gets here." The words, delivered with Eastwood's characteristic understated gravity, echoed in the room long after he had gone. Michael sat in silence, the piece of paper with Eastwood's email clutched in his hand like a talisman. That night, after Lisa had gone home and the hospital had settled into its nighttime routine of dim lights and hushed voices, Michael reached for his laptop. His fingers, weaker than they had been even a week ago, moved slowly across the keyboard. The cursor blinked on the page where he had abandoned his screenplay months ago, after the doctors had used the word terminal for the first time. Word by word, Michael began to write again. Over the next 3 weeks, a remarkable transformation took place in room 307 of St. Mary's Hospital. Though Michael's physical condition continued to deteriorate, his once athletic frame now skeletal, his skin taking on the yellowish pallor characteristic of late-stage pancreatic cancer, his spirit seemed to strengthen in inverse proportion. The hospital staff noticed the change, how he now sat upright against his pillows rather than curled on his side, how he engaged in conversation rather than offering one-word responses. Most notably, they observed his dedicated work on his laptop, sometimes typing for hours despite the obvious pain and fatigue. "He's writing like he's running out of time," one nurse commented to Lisa during a visit, the inadvertent Hamilton reference hanging awkwardly between them. "He is running out of time," Lisa replied softly, watching her brother through the doorway as he squinted at his laptop screen. "But he's also found a reason to use what's left." 2 weeks after Eastwood's visit, Michael completed his screenplay. With trembling fingers, he composed an email to the address Eastwood had provided, attached the document, and pressed send. He had no expectation of a response. Surely Eastwood had hundreds of such interactions, offering kind words and vague promises to people he would promptly forget. But 3 days later, as Michael dozed in the late afternoon sunlight, his laptop pinged with an incoming email. The sender, Clint Eastwood. "Read your screenplay. It's good. Raw and honest. The ending works. Would you object to me sharing it with a producer friend? No promises, but it deserves to be seen. Get well, Clint." The terse message, so characteristic of Eastwood's economical communication style, brought tears to Michael's eyes. Despite the "get well" closing, surely a habitual sign-off rather than a realistic expectation, the recognition of his work as worthy meant everything. Michael responded with his blessing, though he harbored no illusions about his screenplay's future. The act of completion, of creating something whole and meaningful while his body failed him, was accomplishment enough. What Michael couldn't have anticipated was the speed with which things would move. 1 week later, Lisa arrived at the hospital with news that seemed impossible. A producer associated with Eastwood's Malpaso Productions wanted to option Michael's screenplay. The paperwork was being rushed through, an unprecedented acceleration of the typically glacial pace of Hollywood deal-making. "He made this happen," Michael whispered, his voice now so weak that Lisa had to lean close to hear him. "Why would he do that for a stranger?" Lisa had no answer, but the question haunted her as she watched her brother's condition worsen by the day. The doctors had revised their prognosis. No longer weeks, but days. On what would turn out to be Michael's final day, the hospital room was unusually crowded. Former students had been visiting throughout the week, some traveling considerable distances after hearing about their teacher's condition. They brought stories of how his passion for film had influenced their lives, how his encouragement had sustained them through difficult times. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally rousing enough to recognize a face or squeeze a hand. The pain medication made it difficult for him to speak, but his eyes, sunken now in his gaunt face, still communicated his recognition and gratitude. As evening approached and visitors began to leave, a commotion in the hallway caused Lisa to step outside. She returned moments later, her face a mixture of disbelief and emotion. "Mikey," she whispered, leaning close to her brother's ear. "He's here. Clint is here again." Michael's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on the tall figure that moved into his line of vision. Eastwood looked much as he had during his first visit, though perhaps more somber as he took in Michael's visibly deteriorated condition. "I was in town for a meeting," Eastwood explained simply, pulling the chair close to Michael's bed. "Thought I'd stop by to tell you the news in person." Michael waited, conserving his limited energy. "Your screenplay," Eastwood continued, his voice low but clear. "It's been greenlit for production, fast-tracked. We start casting next month." A tear slid down Michael's hollow cheek. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. "You don't need to say anything," Eastwood assured him. "I just wanted you to know that your story will be told. That teacher in your screenplay, the one worried about his legacy, his story matters. Your story matters." With tremendous effort, Michael reached for Eastwood's hand and squeezed it weakly. The two men sat in silence for several minutes. The legendary director and the dying teacher, connected by a shared understanding of what it means to leave something meaningful behind. Before leaving, Eastwood leaned in close and whispered something to Michael that Lisa couldn't hear. Whatever it was brought a peaceful smile to her brother's face, a smile that remained even after he drifted back to sleep. Michael Reeves passed away in the early hours of the following morning, with Lisa at his side. 2 days later, Lisa received a hand-delivered letter. Inside was a note on Malpaso Productions' letterhead, signed by Eastwood. "Your brother's film will be made exactly as he wrote it. The profits will establish a scholarship fund in his name for aspiring filmmakers. Some legacies aren't measured in years, but in lives touched, in stories told. His will continue." 1 year later, The Difference premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim. Though not directed by Eastwood himself, he felt another director could better serve the material. His influence had ensured the project's completion. The film went on to receive numerous awards and, more importantly, touched millions with its honest portrayal of a teacher's search for meaning in the face of mortality. At each screening, a simple dedication appeared before the credits. For Michael Reeves, 1984 to 2023, teacher, writer, friend, your story lives on. In interviews about the film, Eastwood was often asked why he had taken such a personal interest in an unknown screenwriter's final work. His answer remained consistently simple. Sometimes you recognize something true. When you do, you have a responsibility to help it be heard. The millions of viewers who watched Michael's story unfold on screen never knew the full circumstances of its creation. The hospital visits, the email exchanges, the quiet moments of connection between two men from vastly different worlds. But they felt the authenticity that powered the narrative, the urgency of a story told by someone with nothing left to lose and everything still to give. In the years that followed, applications to film programs around the country increased notably, with many applicants citing The Difference as their inspiration. The Michael Reeves Scholarship Fund supported dozens of students who might otherwise never have had the opportunity to study filmmaking. And in a small town in Ohio, a high school film teacher began each semester by showing her students The Difference, telling them the story behind the story, how a chance meeting between a legendary director and a dying teacher created a legacy that continued to touch lives long after both were gone. Some stories end, others continue. Michael's was both.